having some kind of neurodegenerative disease, like as you see your professor writing on the board today, you know that the structure can even change over time. And so there are a lot of shape analysis pipelines where they have a big collection of 3D shapes, and they'd like to find some map between them so that way you can detect when there are interesting changes, what the interesting features are that are maybe in one person and not in another, and so on. Right? So here, for example, I believe there's a postdoc and a faculty member in the Stanford Psychology Department. I forget who's who here. And you can see that from 50 feet away, there's obviously some shared geometric information where maybe you could come up with some rough mapping between points on one object and points on the other. Although at the finest scale, I would argue that in this particular example, whether your map is smooth or not, differentiable, probably doesn't matter, right? Because chances are I can't find a point-to-point correspondence from my brain onto Magnus's. He's got many more folds. So the key question here is how is this different from registration, right? That's what we've been talking about in the last couple of lectures. And I would argue it's really this word, bijectivity and isometry and these sort of geometric regularizers that we've talked about, that we're going to have to relax a lot of these when we talk about mapping between more generic shapes, because parts appear and disappear, really big deformations happen, and coping with that is quite challenging. Does that make sense? So that's sort of the rough, although there's obviously kind of a continuum between these different problems, there's a rough separation that happens in the geometric literature. Incidentally, as an aside, some people use the word mapping to refer to something quite different, which I would call shape deformation. So in the computer graphics literature, if you have a human in one pose and I drag a point, you want to know what the human looks like in another pose. Particularly in Israel, for some reason, papers that come out of research groups there tend to call that procedure of editing a 3D shape based on kind of pinned points mapping. I don't love that terminology, so we're going to think of mapping as I'm given two shapes and I'm trying to find a correspondence from one into the other. Yep, and I can have my debate with Yaron Littman about who's right terminology-wise. And of course, that allows you to do a lot of things, right? So here, again, the thing that we're kind of seeking here is rather than just aligning a shape, we're looking for shared structure. And the example that everybody refers to in this literature is you have a horse and a giraffe, and you're trying to find a correspondence from one into the other. Obviously, these are not, oops, that one's the giraffe. These are not isometric shapes. But you could arguably find a pretty reasonable bijective smooth map and allow yourself to do really practical computer graphics tasks like put giraffe spots on a horse. In fact, actually, our research group has a research paper last year at the Symposium on Geometry Processing, and me and John Fisher is another faculty member at Holloway have a competition for who can have the most kind of goofy figure in a research paper. And so there's this big figure at the top that just has a giraffe and then a horse and a donkey and a human and an elephant, and they all have giraffe stripes on them, and I was very excited about this, which is what I should have put on the slide, but I did not. Okay, and of course there are many applications. So the one that I just mentioned is one that sort of I think motivates a lot of the computer graphics work, which is that it's very difficult to texture a shape, and maybe you texture one object, you want to transfer it onto another. I think this application is actually, in my mind, a little suspect in that I think it's very rare to have a nice detailed texture that applies to more than one shape. But maybe as a starting point, or you put this thing and then you use some other probably machine learning technique to kind of edit your texture after that. I think it is a reasonable procedure and one that's worth thinking about. Closer to computer vision, something, and actually in brain imaging even more so, one of the basic ones is that maybe you go to a lot of painstaking work. You take one 3D model and you segment it into meaningful pieces, right? So I take human and I segment the legs and the heads, the shoulders, the knees, and the toes, and now I have a new human model and I want to infer the segmentation. I don't want to just use one of these unsupervised methods that we talked about a couple lectures ago, but rather the fact that I told you the relevant segments on some other shape, right? If I have a mapping from one to the other, now I can just transfer those labels rather than starting from scratch. Right? So probably for humans, that's somewhat useful. In medical data where it requires a very expensive expert to label every shape that you have, this can be quite valuable, right? Because now you maybe take a few examples of the scan template that you have, and you want to kind of propagate that information to all the other ones. That makes sense? Cool. And there's some other kind of fun ones, right? There's kind of layout or abstraction where maybe you view this weird graph on the left-hand side as an abstract alligator, and you would like to map the nodes of one onto the nodes of the other. or actually one of the places where this stuff comes up, which is kind of interesting, and actually kind of a popular application of this machinery, believe it or not, is in paleontology. So one of the kind of interesting things that happens in that world is that actually a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times evolution happens as sort of a smooth thing when it comes to the rigid structures in your body, like bones and teeth. Right? And so one thing that the paleontologists want to do is to be able to quantify the sort of D-tooth, D-time, right? So like, you know, I don't know, here's the fourth lower molar, and maybe the left one is Sebastian and the right one is Yue's, and you know, Yue is a little more evolved, and so, you know, we want to, you know, be able to highlight what changed, you know, maybe one part's a little sharper or something else, you know. And so in order to do that, you need to have a correspondence, because then you're going to use that correspondence plus maybe the measure of deformation to just highlight on the surface what's changing and quantify, which is a big problem in fields like this, which typically involve lots of, like, I don't know, kind of look at this image and just guess what's changed. So this is one way to quantify and systematize that. Yeah. And it's actually true, a lot of funding for research in this area comes from museums, which is kind of cool. I know that Max works with like the French National Museum, for example. Okay, so in our lecture today, and probably next time, we're going to say that we're given two or more shapes. We're going to keep that in the back of our head. Our goal is to find some mapping F from one shape into the other in a fashion that's maybe automatic, like doesn't require a lot of user interaction. There's a little bit of debate here, like if I can click a few points and clarify my correspondence problem, maybe that's more valuable than like some unsupervised method that takes 1,000 years and with probability P fails. You know, it's efficient, maybe bijective if you want some kind of global thing, and low distortion. And all of these are extremely fuzzy words that we'll try to fill in during our lecture. Does that make sense? So this is the basic correspondence task. Incidentally, it does not just happen on teeth. It also happens on abstract stuff, right? So when we talk about transfer learning, that's exactly finding correspondence from one data set into another. And indeed, a lot of the techniques we'll talk about look awfully similar in that world, although it's harder to draw pictures, yeah? Okay. Before we talk about correspondence algorithms, one of the important things to ask, which is actually subtle and was neglected for a long time, is how do you know when you're doing well in a problem like this? And actually, it's not 100% clear. And I highlight this only to kind of demonstrate to you guys that there's many considerations that are largely engineering decisions that go into using algorithms like this that prioritize different notions of distortion. Like actually after class last time, we were talking about some of the differences between maybe the medical imaging community and computer graphics. And I think some of them are hiding in figures like this, that like the types of errors that the two communities care about is quite different. So for instance, let's say that I have two poses of a teddy bear, one of our favorite 3D models in graphics literature. Yeah? And there's a very typical way to visualize correspondences. So what I'm going to do is put some texture on one object and then just transfer that texture to the other by mapping the vertex texture coordinates forward. A pretty reasonable thing to do. For some reason, they usually have digits or letters on them. I don't know why, but anyway. Yeah, so here are two different maps of one teddy bear onto another. And initially, oops, I guess I'm kind of giving it away with the subtitles here. How many of us think the left map is probably the desirable one? How many of us think the right map is the desirable one? Yeah, always the rebel over here. Yeah, the answer is that it's actually not clear. So in particular, and this way, actually, figures like this are quite misleading. The left one kind of feels better because it's smooth. Yeah, but like if you step 50 feet away, it might be the case that certain features are actually better aligned, even if locally there's some noise on one map or another. Yes, we're gonna return to that in a minute, and that's what makes evaluating these techniques really tricky. And so there's a lot of different ways that people use to just visualize the performance of algorithms in this area. Here I've shown you a pretty typical plot of what this looks like. By the way, a lot of these slides are stolen. These ones are stolen from my colleague Danielle at the Technion. So here we have a mapping from one human into another human. And one of the typical things that people do is they visualize plots like this. And these are hard to read. So what's going on here? The x-axis is on units of diameter of the surface. Right? So 1 would be kind of like the distance from the feet to the head. Okay? And then what's happened here is that somebody has marked a bunch of ground truth matches from one surface into the other. In fact, I think this particular pair of surfaces was just gotten by deformation, but then you kind of forgot the deformation, now you're trying to compute the map, right? And you want to know how well you did. So the x-axis here is error, and the y-axis is percentage of points. Yeah, so if I go all the way to the right, I'll get 100%. So this is like how many of the points were correctly mapped within 5% of the radius of the shape. Does that make sense? Or diameter of the shape. So what is this plot saying? It's saying, well, within 0.1, my algorithm has succeeded. Is this a good map? It looks okay, like it goes up. Think about what this means. This is 10% of the diameter of the shape, right? That's like this, right? So these plots are actually quite deceptive. And I encourage you guys, when you read these papers, including my own, to look really carefully at these plots and think about what they're telling you geometrically, because I think they can hide quite a bit. And that's actually quite tricky. So let's play a fun game. So here, let's see, we have geodesic error on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we have two different mappings, right? Both of these are going from the left person to the right one. Yeah? And our question is, which of these two things is map number one? So map number one kind of has, most of the error is contained within the first, 2.5% or so. Map number two is much more broad. So, which one of these is map one? The left one? What do we vote? How about the right one? Why do you say that? Just because like you're being contrary, or like have we thought through it? What was that? So the one on the right, I'm not sure that's true. I would argue that this one's probably smoother, right? There's no like bumpy, well, there are a few bumpy edges, but not too many. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the left one, it's smoother and looks nicer, but like the actual correspondence to make it smoother, it's sort of not actually corresponding. So the radius of the geodesic distance is going to be larger for full sections of that point.
Yeah.
Noisy,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually quite aligned.
Yeah, so in fact, if you look, I think, what's a good place to look on the surface here? If you compare, yeah, the left hand. No, that actually looks reasonable to me, no? No, I got that right. That's this one, yeah? Yeah. But no, it looks more, well, right, it's red and then pink. Oh yeah, no, actually you're right, I'm sorry. Yeah, so if you look at the hand, Sebastian's absolutely right. I should always listen to him. Notice that the hand is extremely distorted on the smoother map. Yeah? And similarly, the one that I noticed, if you look on the leg, right, that like the number 4 is their knee. Yeah. And on the smoother map, the knee is mapped to the entire leg. So anyway, this is just to say that all these different visualizations communicate slightly different information. And yeah, so here's another example for fun. Oh, never mind. Yeah. So anyway, so that confirms our example. So now, of course, there are many different notions of distortion, right? So geodesic error would be like distance. A different one would be conformal distortion. Right? So this would be like locally, do I preserve angles between points? Now, what do we think? Which one's map 1 and which one's map 2? So how many of us think that map 1, so that's the one with the, arguably the worst conformal distortion? How many think the map 1 is the left guy? Map 2. Yeah, you guys are absolutely right, because here the angles are getting screwed up all over the place locally, right? And so if that's what you care about, then the quality of the two maps flips. Yeah? And so all this is to say, in some sense, this is a multi-objective problem, and there's no one measure that tells you the best mapping. It really depends on your application. And like, for instance, maybe what you really care about is that certain segments get mapped to each other. You don't really care what happens on the inside, right? That'd be pretty typical in some medical domains. Or maybe you just want something smooth, like I want to do texture transfer, and like, yeah, if I slippage the surface of the horse against itself a little bit, it's no big deal, because I shouldn't be mapping a horse to a giraffe anyway. I just want some reasonable texture. Yeah? Does that make sense? Any questions so far? This just kind of gets you thinking critically about this stuff. Okay, so how are we going to solve this in practice? How do we solve mapping problems? Yeah. Uniquely identify every point. That's certainly the output that we're looking for. How are we going to do that? We actually talked about a few in this course. Yeah, so that's actually a reasonable one. Would be compute a signature for every point or a descriptor and then just try to match each other. You can run into trouble, right? The human has left and right symmetry, and you got to figure out how to disambiguate that. Yue, you had a suggestion? To compute pairwise distance and solve a quadratic assignment problem. Yes, that's something you could do. All of these are things that we could do, absolutely. So we'll talk about any of them. And in fact, this literature is kind of fun because there's a lot of different ways you could go about solving this problem. And actually, so far, there's no consensus on what's best. Cool. So let's start with, so we're going to go roughly in historical order because this is as good as any for this area. So some of the earliest mapping techniques took shapes and first converted them. What are these, those like little micro animals that like live in water molecules? I feel like this thing looks kind of like it. Yeah, anyway. Right, so the one thing you could do if somebody clicks a bunch of points that correspond to the two shapes, right, is use those to just divide those two shapes into patches that correspond to one another. Okay, that's not so hard, like by computing shortest path maybe. And remember that if I have a disk topology patch with 3 corners, what can I do? I can map it into the plane, right? By using these parameterization tools like we talked about all the way in lecture 2. You guys remember this? So if I have a shape with disk topology, and I prescribe the positions of all the vertices on the boundary, I can solve a least squares problem to place all the vertices on the interior. Yeah? And that looks something like this. Now we know, we didn't know in lecture 2 of this course, but what do we know now? What is the matrix that's really hiding underneath this optimization problem? Laplacian, can't get away from it, yeah? And indeed, so what could I do? If I have these 2 rhinos and I've marked sort of sparse points that correspond to one another, so I sort of have, in some sense, a very coarse triangulation. Do you see that? Like there's a triangle sitting here, yeah? Well now, I could take each of those triangles and parameterize them onto the same domain on top of each other, and just compose one map into the other and have a mapping between the 2 surfaces. What do you think the error looks like along a map like this? Where do you think it's concentrated? Yeah, on the seams, right? I've done nothing to make the distortion low at the seams. Yeah? But it is a way to get a bijective map. And indeed, this is one of the earliest techniques dating back to about 2004. And when I say bijective, I actually mean it. So there's a nice theorem, which we don't have time to prove in this course, but it's not terribly complicated. Actually, the graphics version was proven by a professor at Harvard by the name of Steve Gortler, where essentially what you can show is if you prescribe all of the boundary vertices, and you solve that linear system, then as long as the weights here are all positive, that map is bijective. In other words, every triangle doesn't overlap with every other triangle. This is called Tutt's theorem. And so what does that tell you? That tells you if I take those 2 surfaces and I chunk them up into kind of coarse triangles, and then I co-parameterize each one, then the mapping I'll get when I compose those 2 things is actually a mapping. There's not like some issue where like they overlap somehow in that shared plane. That make sense? So we're going to have a lot of slides that look like this. What's the trade-off? Well, for one thing, it's pretty easy. It's sort of straightforward to understand what's going on and easy to plug into applications. The cons are, well, you need to click these different landmarks, right? You need a bunch of points in order to sort of reliably get a triangulation. And more, even worse off, like there's no notion of distortion here, right? This is totally ad hoc procedure. That makes sense? But it's sort of a simple example of what you might do. And for, gosh, quite a while, that was really the only algorithm that was out there. Okay, so recently this idea of co-parameterization, that's the vocabulary word that we should think about. The idea that sometimes it's easier not to map from A into B, but to take A and B and map into some shared domain in between. This idea was revisited in a really cool set of papers. So this Tutt theorem has basically a really bad restriction, which is what's making these techniques hard to use, right? Which is that it only applies to things with disk topology. Right? They have to look like little circles in the plane. Yeah? So it's an interesting observation. Let's say I have a disk, or slightly more easily, I have a rectangle, and I want to make it into a torus, into a donut. How could I do that? Yeah, I could glue these 2 edges together. That makes it into a cylinder, right? And now I could glue these 2, might not look like circles, but they are because I've made it into a cylinder. Now I glue these 2 things together and I have a donut. This is the kind of a typical diagram in topology. If you take undergrad topology class, you draw a lot of stuff that looks like this. So there's one more kind of leap of faith you can make when you draw pictures like this, which is, let's say I take the entire coordinate plane, yeah? And I view this as sort of the unit square. Right? It's just the coordinates 0 to 1, 0 to 1. Apparently my mapping is not, my axis, I didn't do axis equal in MATLAB here. Okay, so in other words, I can mark off all the coordinates. And I can divide the whole plane into a bunch of squares. I think I've managed to do that, almost. There we go. Yep. Then I could design a really weird piece of paint software that obeys my boundary conditions, right? Where like, let's say that I want to paint, I want to put a smiley face on the torus. Yeah, so like I draw one here, and then my piece of paint software just copies it over and over again, right? And maybe notice I very carefully chose a symmetric shape to draw, because what happens when I go here? Well, I kind of wrap around the other side like that. So this is called a quotient of the plane. The idea that I take the entire plane, then I quotient it with this relationship. We're going to glue these two edges together. Right. So actually, there's a really neat extension of Tutt's theorem, which is fun to read about, and was proposed just a few years ago. And what they said is like, well, we know how to map stuff into planes as long as they're disk topology. The problem is that nothing in real life is disk topology. But I can get a lot of other topologies by taking the plane and quotienting by a few simple relationships. And there's actually an extension of Tutt's theorem to this case, which is not too complicated if you buy Tutt's theorem. There's the big if there. You can see the kind of things that end up happening. So here, what they do is they take this lion and they map it into this patch. And every time you see the same color twice, there's some identification going on. Every time you see a vertex, it's kind of like a gluing point. So here it would be like zipping up in this direction. Do you guys see how to draw this? And so the neat thing is that by solving a linear system, rather than just parametrizing a disk, you can actually parametrize things into any quotient of the plane, which is pretty neat. So if you like this kind of stuff, it's really a fun and slightly terrifying read to look at. This is called an orbifold Tutt embedding. The main author of this paper, who's now at Adobe, unsurprisingly, sort of had a whole series of papers. So this was mappings into quotients of the plane, like in Euclidean space. And then, of course, the next one they did was mappings into quotient of the hyperbolic plane. And then the third one they did was mapping into quotient of the sphere. And that pretty much covers all the cases you could possibly want. Yeah? So it's really neat stuff. One of the big issues here, like I showed you how to get a torus, because that's the easy construction. Think about taking a double torus, like two donuts glued together. You think you could get a quotient of the plane that gives you that topology? It's not so obvious, yeah? So it turns out the hyperbolic space, namely this Poincare disk, has many more quotients than the plane, which is a really fun and interesting area to read about. So like if you're interested in what's this artist's name? I was supposed to say MC Hammer, but that's not right. MC Escher, thank you. MC Escher has a lot of art that involves basically quotients of the hyperbolic plane, which is fun to look at. So you should check that out. And all he's doing is putting interesting topologies to kind of glue shapes together. Okay. However, by the way, there's one drawback of this technique. So let's say I want to map two different donut topology shapes into each other, and so I map them both into this quotient of the plane. There's actually two drawbacks to think about. One is if you look closely at these algorithms, you'll notice that error ends up kind of concentrating at the singular points. You have to place them very carefully. But more importantly, these parameterization algorithms are designed to minimize distortion of your shape mapping into this flat thing. That is not the same as minimizing the distortion of one shape mapped into the other. And that's the big drawback of these co-parametrization techniques. Does that make sense? You sort of got this middleman that's in between the two shapes that you're really trying to map to each other, and the thing that you're minimizing distortion to, like, you kind of don't care about, right? And indeed, that creates a lot of problems in techniques like this that are hard to address. Cool. Of course, there are many ways to kind of patch up some of the bugs in these algorithms. The different bug that pops up, you still have to compute some landmarks, right? You still have to punch some points that are interesting. And of course, there are many different ways to compute interesting landmarks. We've covered some in this class, right? Like the heat kernel signature, if you kind of look at extrema of that, gives you a reasonable set of points. Okay, so I've whined a lot about distortion of a map, but I haven't actually told you what that means. Yeah, and in fact, there are many notions of distortion, and this is a good juncture as any to just kind of say, well, what do we mean when we say that a map distorts one surface when it gets mapped onto another? Yeah. And in particular, this is well defined when I map a surface into the plane. That's where a lot of these measures come from. Yeah. So let's say that I run this technique. So I take this surface, I divide it into triangles, and I parameterize each one of them. And I forget about the other surface. I just want to know what the distortion is mapping into the plane. How would I do that? Well, somehow, if every triangle moves rigidly into the plane, so all three of its edge lengths are conserved, then I'm pretty happy. Like I'm very happy, extremely happy. And then as the edge lengths change, then we get in trouble. That make sense? So here's a triangle. Here's a nice thing. So let's say that I have a triangle in the plane. I have another triangle in the plane, and I map one onto the other. Yeah? So then how many numbers do I know? I know where 3 points went, so that's 6 values overall. How many values define an affine map of the plane? Okay, well, it's clearly not 0, so then the only other answer in our list of answers we can give is whatever the last number was that I said, yeah? It's 6, right? Because what is an affine map of the plane, right? There's a matrix, it's like AX plus B, yeah? So the A is 2 by 2 here because we're in the plane, and then B is like a translation. So conveniently, if I map a triangle onto another triangle, it's precisely the number of degrees of freedom I need to have an affine mapping, right? So in other words, there's just typically people use the word linear here, but they really mean affine because there's translation. But if I map a triangle into another triangle, that is just a linear map, yeah? And by the way, the 3D aspect here is kind of irrelevant, right? Because I could take every triangle, I could unglue the triangle mesh and take every one individually and map it into the plane. That's okay, right? And then it becomes a map of the plane into itself to evaluate the distortion of every triangle independently. That makes sense? I'm waving my arms around a lot. I can draw pictures if you want. Okay, cool. So then what do I get? I get that my map looks like matrix times x plus a constant. Is a constant relevant for measuring distortion? No, this is translation. Is the entire matrix relevant for measuring distortion? Probably not, right? Like if my triangle rotates, I don't really care. So what is relevant? What can I do to a matrix to reveal its distortion structure? Yeah, how do I cut out rotational part of a matrix? I'll give you a hint. We did this in our last lecture. We only did one thing to a matrix in our last lecture. SVD, yeah? Because what does the SVD do? It takes a matrix and it writes it as rotation times a diagonal of 3 stretch values times another rotation. Yeah? So what's going to be relevant for measuring distortion, right? The sum over all the triangles of the distortion of each triangle is not going to be J. It's really just the singular values of J that matter. Does that make sense? Cool. By the way, how many singular values are there? 2, yeah, because it's a triangle. Cool. So our question was, how do you measure distortion? The answer is all kinds of different ways. And if you look in the literature, conveniently there's this nice table in this Rabinovich paper. There are all kinds of functions of singular values you can see written here that all measure different notions of distortion. And the basic issue here is that there's 2 different ways that triangles can distort, right? They can scale and they can shear. And you have to decide on your trade-off between those things when you come up with a distortion measure. Yeah. By the way, in physics, people have known this for a long time. They call this a constitutive model, right? And this has to do with the potential energy of a physical object as it deforms. Right. So, for instance, the Dirichlet energy. Remember that what was my Dirichlet energy? Well, in this notation, it's actually you can measure it, right? Because remember that the Dirichlet energy of a map, I differentiate the map, and I got this J, and essentially I just took the norms of its columns and squared them and summed them up. So that fits here. So what would that be as a function of the singular values? It'd just be sigma 1 squared plus sigma 2 squared, right? It just wants us to be small. And that makes sense, right? Because actually, the Dirichlet energy doesn't care about distortion. It's perfectly happy with everything collapsing, right? And so in more complex constitutive models, maybe I say like, well, you know, here's this is some measure of distortion that doesn't like triangles to get too big. Maybe I also don't want them to compress too much, so maybe I do something like that. This is called the symmetric Dirichlet energy. Ironically, this is actually not symmetric because you have to integrate over your surface, and this doesn't account for the area element, but that's a detail. And so essentially, people have all kinds of different sort of models for what it means to distort. By the way, what if I don't care about scaling? I just care about conformal deformation. I just care about angles. What could I do? If sigma 1 and sigma 2 are like 17, does that matter? No, right? Because that just corresponds to scaling the whole triangle. Yeah? So I just care about conformal distortion. Actually, the only thing I care about is the ratio between the two sigmas, and I'd like that thing to be close to 1. Yeah? So for instance, if I want a conformal map, one way to do it would be to look at sigma, I think, 2 over sigma 1 minus 1 squared. If I recall, this is called MIPS energy. But anyway, essentially for every distortion you can think of, somebody has cooked up some reason why you might want it. And that's the way to read tables like this, right? Is that this is just something that's penalizing different types of distortion and it's sort of reflecting what you care about in a map, right? Remember we talked about like there's no one best map. It really depends on your priorities, and you see that reflected right here. Make sense? Cool. Right, and so a related problem, incidentally, is with every one of these things, these are extremely potentially non-convex, weird energies that go from vertex positions to distortion. And just optimizing these is an extremely large-scale non-convex optimization problem, right? Because you're optimizing all the locations of all the vertices of some triangle mesh in the plane. And furthermore, by the way, you have a bunch of constraints, because if any two triangles overlap, the whole parametrization is kind of useless. And so there are many papers, including stuff that's quite recent, right? I mean, this is 2017. Your TA has a paper that came out about the same time. I was a jerk and chose the other guy's paper. But in any event, this optimization problem, solving it efficiently is actually quite challenging and largely open. Although less so, right? This is a mesh, I think, with on the order of 100,000 triangles. Okay. There's a big drawback with all of these techniques. Well, there are many, but one of them in the coparametrization world is that all of our measures of distortion are local. Yeah? And so remember that we had these maps from humans that kind of looked smooth locally, but then like the whole leg is like pulled up on the other guy's like arm or something like that. That actually kind of look okay in these measures because like as I kind of walk along this surface, I'm moving smoothly. It really is not locally distorting that much. But then if I look like over long distances, we see that there was some drift. Right? And this is a high-level takeaway in a lot of the mapping literature, which is that long-distance interactions can really stabilize geometry, right? That just minimizing like an elastic energy like this, there are a lot of things that look quite similar, right? So think about taking like a long elastic rod and just bending it into a U shape. The potential energy of that is not super high, right? But geometrically, they're quite different objects, yeah? But if I just take the endpoints of that rod and I say, no, this guy goes here and that guy goes there, and fill in everything in between, then I can correct these kind of long-range interactions. Does that picture make sense? Cool. Right, and so there are many different models that try to address this issue. One that we already mentioned a couple lectures ago is this idea of Gromov-Hausdorff distance, right? Where here, rather than like taking derivatives of my map, I do kind of the opposite. I look at distortion of the distance function over the worst pair distorted points over the whole domain, right? So remember, we kind of talked about how to read this thing, where phi is a map from one guy into another, right? And the way the amount of money that I pay for a given map is I find the pair of points x and x prime, so that the distance from x to x prime relative to the distance from y to y prime, which are their targets, respectively, is distorted the most. Yeah, so this would be like, oh, when I mapped, UA onto Magnus, like his left hand, the distance from his left hand to his right hand relative to the distance between Magnus's wingspan is quite different, and that's going to be the way that I evaluate my map. But maybe that's a better map than like if I mapped one hand to one hand and the other hand to like his foot, So we already had one example of a technique like two, actually. I guess we talked a little bit about how to optimize problems that look like this. But even earlier than that, we actually talked about multidimensional scaling. Everything in this course comes back, right? So in multidimensional scaling, if you think about it, what was that trying to do? It's trying to take a pairwise distance matrix and embed it into Euclidean space, in that case, in a way where all of the distances resemble one another, right? This is different from like just taking the derivative of the map and asking that that's small. That make sense? Of course, the problem with MDS is it's restricted to linear maps. So naturally, what people proposed, which should come as a surprise to nobody, is generalized MDS, which is roughly just optimizing this Gromov-Hausdorff distance, right? So this GMDS literature, which is quite popular and led to a number of research papers in correspondence, sort of said, well, I like this idea of this MDS energy, so that's what I'm going to try and compute, is a mapping or a permutation of the points from here to here that minimizes some notion of the distortion of the distance function. I'll call this Gromov-Hausdorff, but in this literature they call it GMDS, which is fine. So coparameterization is relatively easy numerically, right? Like it's a linear system, at least the paper that I mentioned to you guys. How easy do you think it is to solve this problem? I'll give you a hint. Like let's say that instead of like cute 3D hands, I had graphs. So what am I trying to do? I'm trying to find a map from one graph. So let's say in fact I have 2 copies of the same graph to make my life even easier, yeah? But I forgot the label of the vertices. And I just want to make one graph look like the other. I just want to map one graph onto the other in a way that preserves pairwise distance, which would be the same thing as preserving graph structure. Does that problem ring a bell? It's worse than that. Well, it's not worse. Yeah, this is called graph isomorphism, right? This idea that I have 2 graphs and I just want to know are they the same graph or not. Like maybe I reorder the vertices. And if you take a look, this is nothing more than graph isomorphism, right? Like if you think of these triangle meshes as graphs where the edge weights are distances, right? Then all I'm trying to do here is align one graph to another and minimize some notion of distortion. In fact, it's worse than that, right? Like really these problems are often subgraph isomorphism, right? Because I like have a hand and then I have a whole 3D model I'm trying to analyze. Yeah? Or, as you mentioned, these also can be written as quadratic. It's typically easier to take one hard problem and write it in a way that looks like another hard problem. That's not a terribly difficult thing to do. So one way to do that is to say, okay, these 3 constraints cut out a very particular set of matrices. Can you guys eyeball and see what it is? So all of the entries are binary. The rows, sorry, that shouldn't be P0 and P1. I copy-pasted my slides from a different talk. These should just be 1 and 1. You guys can guess what talk I copy-pasted this from. Right, so what is this set of matrices if these are both 1s? The rows sum to 1, the columns sum to 1. They're square, all their entries are binary. Let's do some examples. Until you guys answer, I'm going to just keep asking this. Yeah, so here's a matrix that satisfies these constraints. Here's another one. Here's a third. Should I keep going? Right, the rows sum to 1, columns sum to 1. Oh my God, somebody? Pierre? Say it like you believe it. It's a permutation, yes. Okay. Right, so all this is saying is that I want to permute the vertices of one mesh onto another and optimize some quadratic energy function when I do that, which is exactly what you see in this slide here. Yeah? Whew. Okay, and unfortunately these are NP hard. These are hard problems to solve. But that doesn't stop us in practice. By the way, like in this notation it's a little sneaky, like maybe I relax this constraint and make it t greater than or equal to 0. It kind of looks like those transport problems Sebastian was talking about. Sadly, it's still NP hard if you do that. In fact, typically you still get a permutation matrix, but that's a separate thing. And that actually makes some sense. Like if you think of like easy problems in this space as sort of convex looking ones, there's a big issue, which is like if I map one human onto another, there's clearly 2 optima that are equally good, right? Like if all I care about is preserving distance between points, right? I could map left onto left and right onto right, or I could invert this whole guy. And from like an intrinsic standpoint, those are the same. So there's 2 good points in my optimization problem, and I guarantee you the map halfway in between them is pretty bad. So this is a non-convex problem, sort of just naturally, right? And it has lots of local optima, right? Like if I map, so this example is not so bad. If I map like a starfish onto a starfish, there's what, symmetry group like Z mod 5 cross product with Z mod 2 because starfish are vertically symmetric also, that acts on my set of maps, all of which are equally good. It's a complicated way of saying that starfish have 5 points. Yeah? Okay. Right, so again, if we go back to our trade-off here, algorithms like GFDS are really great in that, for one thing, they give you a distance between shapes. We talked about that before. And they handle extremely non-isometric objects, right? They're just trying to find sort of the best mapping that kind of looks isometry-ish. It's extremely non-convex space, and it's a huge search space, right? It's a set of all permutations. It scales factorially in the size of your problem. But of course, you need to solve these things in practice, and there are many different ways to do it, right? So some techniques, for example, might take surfaces and then kind of partition them. So here you can see they're kind of roughly Voronoi cells on these shiny human things. And maybe I map between those first, and then I refine. Or I guess here, I don't even think they refine. What they do is they take, maybe the center points, and they just interpolate between them in some nice kind of linear way. That gives you some reasonable-ish map. Or maybe you even do coarse define. Like first I do that mapping, and then I take everything and subdivide it, and then do the next map, and so on. Or you could even do some kind of partial scenario. Like here, we have a human and like a weirdly buff centaur, and I'm trying to not only solve the GMDS problem, but also notice that only his upper half is relevant to my mapping, right? So maybe I'm trying to find a segmentation and then a map, and I go back and forth. This actually could be useful to regularize your mapping system, right? Because oftentimes it's much easier to find parts than it is to find a bijective map. And so you might as well leverage that in your computational routine. By the way, I'm not describing these algorithms in detail because most of them are outdated. I think what matters here is just the high level, like what are these people doing and how are they thinking about this stuff, okay? Cool. So if we go back to our list of kind of desirable properties for a mapping, what did we get? Well, we got low distortion and that it's sort of automatic to compute, but these are extremely slow techniques, and it's very hard to enforce bijectivity unless you really restrict yourself to permutation. Oftentimes that's the first thing that gets relaxed, right? So in these coarse-defined procedures, for example, it would be very hard to get a bijective map. Because like what would happen if you took, for instance, a very common scenario in these algorithms, which is a really frustrating local optimum. I know, I've written code in this area quite a bit. Is like my right foot gets mapped to Yizhang's right foot, and my left hand gets mapped to his right hand, because somehow locally the distortion's okay. And there's like this weird twist in the midsection that happens. And it's very hard to get out of that local optimum. And it's very hard to make that bijective looking without some pretty crazy stuff. Yeah? But like on that coarse picture, like here, that probably looks like an okay map because there aren't enough points in his midsection to resolve that rotational motion. Yeah? And so that's the kind of typical local optimum you can get stuck in these kinds of problems. So if you guys work on mapping, you should draw lots of pictures of all the different ways you could break these techniques, because there are many. Okay, one recent one that we actually already talked about was which helps stabilize these measurements a little bit is to replace that max with an expectation. Right? So this is the Skvormov-Wasserstein distance we talked about right after Sebastian's lecture, which almost is optimal transport, except for that pesky d gamma all the way on the right-hand side. The second one, the first one's okay. Right? Because optimal transport, remember, is a linear assignment problem. And unfortunately here, like what am I trying to say? I'm saying if x goes to y and y goes to y prime, then this distance should be small. So I need to kind of multiply two values together. Right? That's what's going on here. Like the if x goes to y, the multiply is the and x prime goes to y prime. Yeah? So there are many ways to optimize that. You might recall from Sebastian's lecture that optimal transport people like problems that almost look like this. Right? Like here it would be, right, we had some cost multiplied by some matrix that looks like a map. The only difference was that in the thing I just showed you, there was like a Tij and then a Tkl. Right? There's like an additional T there. But one thing you could do is just squint and ignore that. And that's roughly what goes on in this technique. So what you do is you pretend like this d gamma here is a constant, and you bake it into this cost function. And now it's a transport problem. Now we can solve it. But the only problem is, of course, that these guys have to be equal, right? So what do? You iterate. Now you pretend like that gamma you just got from the transport problem is your new constant. And one thing you can show is that that procedure actually has to converge, which is pretty neat, I think. And so that leads to a very simple algorithm. So what you guys coded on your homework was actually half of the code you need to get a quadratic assignment technique to work, right? Because this is the optimal transport problem that you did in your homework, hopefully. Yeah? Yeah, okay. All right. This is one of many different ways of solving these kinds of problems in practice for a very interesting point of comparison on the sort of convex theoretically justified versus non-convex and fast spectrum. On the opposite end of that is this technique that I've shown you here. Notice, by the way, the dates on this, well, I guess there's nothing to notice. One thing you can know is that the dates on these papers are recent. These are new problems. Yeah? In this work, they want to know, when can I solve quadratic assignment exactly? Like, when can I get the global optimum of this problem and be happy with it? Yeah? So even if I have like more than 4 points, I probably can't solve this by just enumerating all, n factorial maps and just choosing the best one. Okay, maybe I give you like, what, 7? I don't know what's, but in any event, beyond that, it would be an awfully slow algorithm. Remember in our last lecture, we talked about semi-definite program relaxations of problems? This is another great example of a problem that admits an STP relaxation. So here what they do is they make a new, this is a little bit crazy. So in the mapping algorithms, like quadratic assignment, remember your variable is a permutation matrix? They make a new, and remember what we did in that STP relaxation? We said our new variable is going to be a product of every pair of old variables. So what goes on in this research paper is they make, and that's hiding in this cute notation right here. They say X is my unknown permutation matrix. And this little bracket operator takes a matrix and it's like colon in MATLAB. It takes a matrix and just writes it as one long vector. And then they take the outer product of that vector in itself. This is a really giant binary matrix. By the way, if I'm mapping from one object with n points onto another object with n points, how many entries are in this matrix? So first of all, how many entries are in X? N squared. So how many entries are in Y? N to the fourth. But what's the good news? That's polynomial in N. Yeah? And so if what you care about is asymptotics, you've actually done better than the algorithms that we have with guarantees. Yeah? And so this is actually a nearly equivalent formulation of quadratic assignment to what we wrote before. And then just like our last lecture, what do? They drop that rank 1 constraint and out comes a convex problem they can solve, where with high probability you can get a permutation matrix and solve quadratic assignment. The only problem is that you can do this again for problems of size up to about 6. Right? And you can actually see that in their figure. Right? So here they're mapping a bunch of octopi. I guess they managed to get it to be 9 points, right? 1 per tentacle plus a bald spot. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for improving. In fact, I think the same authors, so this is sort of the tight relaxation, meaning this is sort of the closest convex problem to this extremely non-convex quadratic assignment problem. And so in particular, when you're mapping very asymmetric shapes, these techniques tend to succeed. Remember that kind of schematic we drew last time? Kind of surprising it works for these octopi. My personal bet is that what's going on is that on each octopus, one tentacle is slightly longer than the others, which breaks the symmetry. But I digress. In any event, the same set of authors have also proposed a bunch of relaxations that aren't tight, but are much faster to solve. And actually, these can be quite practical for mapping. Cool? So that's on the opposite end of the extreme. So far we have sort of fast things with no guarantees, really slow things with some or a lot of guarantees, depending on how you do the details. So far, we've made very few assumptions on our shape, right? Like all we've said is we want something low distortion, and that's great for mapping humans to centaurs and brains to brains and brains to giraffes and giraffes to horses and horses to centaurs and all these things, yeah? But oftentimes we know more about our shape, right? Like for instance, articulated humans, or I guess elephants, are very typical in the graphics domain, where we don't want a piece of software that can map anything to anything else. We just want a piece of software that maps elephants. That's all I want. Yeah, and in that case, then algorithms we've already talked about in this course are extremely relevant, right? So, for instance, we talked about using the heat kernel signature, and I think we suggested all the way at the beginning of lecture a totally reasonable and extremely fast way to compute correspondence, right? Which is you compute the heat kernel signature for every point, which is just a way to describe the local geometry. yeah? And then what do you do on the other element? You just find the closest match in heat kernel space. So you just iterate over every point, find the closest one. And actually there's a theorem that tells you what? That as long as your objects don't have too many symmetries, so no repeated eigenvalues, you actually get a bijective smooth map. But remember the assumption of our theorem in a heat kernel map was that your shapes have to be isometric. And as we know, there are very few shapes in the real world that are isometric. Yeah? And so the trade-off here is that now there's a tiny search space, so we no longer have the space of all permutations. All you have to do is just look over the other shape and choose the closest guy. The problem is just that these methods never work. And so typically you want something kind of in between, right? Like maybe you put descriptors on the surface, but then you still optimize for a permutation because you expect there to be a little bit of error when you do that. Does that make sense? And we'll come back to that, actually precisely that in just a minute for another of the many works of Solomon et al. That you'll see in today's lecture. This happens to be a topic that's very close to my heart. But there are actually many things in the continuum of between like weak or no assumptions, right? Like just finding something that minimizes distortion, all the way to an algorithm that only works if you give it isometric shapes. Can anybody name like categories of maps that are less rigid but not fully general? So remember we talked about those different notions of distortion before, things we can measure from Jacobian. What can we measure from the Jacobian of a map of a triangle? Two things. Angles and areas, yeah? And in particular, there's a very big space of maps that just preserve angles. Yeah? Anybody know what these things are called? I know that like at least 7 people in this room do because I've had conversations with them about it. They're called conformal maps, right? And these are maps that preserve angles but not areas. So like doubling a surface is okay, like inflating it is kind of okay as long as you do it in a kind of crazy way, but shearing is not. The opposite of that, where you preserve areas, is actually closer to what Sebastian talked about in optimal transport, and is largely open in this context. Okay, so one observation about mapping is that finding isometries is hard and typically too stiff. It's very hard to find an isometric map from one shape into another. One kind of beautiful fact about differential geometry is that there's a huge space of conformal maps between any pair of surfaces with the same topology. And so this actually gives you a reasonable world to optimize in. And in fact, actually, one of the really cool things you can do is if I want to find an isometric map, one thing I might do is say, find the conformal map with the smallest area distortion, and if there exists an isometric map, I'll find it, yeah? Because that's the one with 0 area distortion. That make sense? And so this was a popular idea for quite some time in the mapping literature. In particular, there's a vocabulary word that I could never say from conformal geometry because I struggle with words with more than a few syllables. Uniformization, whatever, which is the idea that I can conformally map objects into a few different kind of base domains, always, and one of those is the plane. This actually depends on the topology of your shape. And so there's a theorem out there, conveniently called the uniformization theorem, which says I can take any sphere, topologically speaking, so, or equivalently, any cat, and map its outer surface to the extended plane. Those of you who took my undergrad graphics class actually know what that is, but they saw it in a very different context. Remember when we talked about projective geometry? Right, we talked about the plane as having 3 coordinates, x, y, z, modulo a relationship that x, y, z and cx, cy, and cz are all the same. And that's great, except when your third coordinate is 0, because then you can't divide by that third guy to go back to the plane. Right? And this is called the projectivization of the plane, and it kind of adds just one point that glues everything together. Is that the schematic you can have in mind is that the plane looks like a sphere if like there's the plane, but then if I like go far enough that way, I come back this way. But I got to go really, really far to do that. Yeah, like hella far. And so yeah, and this is a clever trick because once I map objects into the plane conformally, which I'll tell you how to do in a second, then what do I do to find a conformal map from one surface into another? Well, there's a convenient fact, which is if I map surface A into the plane, surface B into the plane, and I do those both, those are both independently conformal maps, then the composition of those things is itself conformal, right? Because I preserve angles in every step. So now I can forget about the surfaces completely and just talk about conformal maps of the plane. Yeah, sneaky trick. So then we need two ingredients. We need, how do I take a surface and find some conformal map of that surface into the plane? And then how do I take the plane and conformally map it to itself? Okay? First of all, how do I conformally map the plane to itself? Does anybody know? Mobius transformation. We'll come back to that in a second. How do I map a surface into the plane? Uniformization, that's how. But we'll talk about how in a second. Right, and so one of the early algorithms of correspondence that's quite effective, and actually sort of, I think, inspired this big literature because it was the first algorithm that I would argue like worked, was this technique called Mobius voting. The idea was I take, and we're going to fill in the details in a second, I map both surfaces into the plane. It's conveniently to think of the plane as a set of complex numbers, so like here's the real part, here's the complex part. If you've taken a complex analysis class, then you've talked a lot about conformal maps. You might not have realized it at the time, but you did. Because that conformal in their world is what? Holomorphic? Yep. Okay, is that right? I always get this vocabulary wrong. I don't know, whatever. In any event, what we'll see is that 3 points determine a conformal self-map of the plane. This is the Mobius transformations. And so if I want to map one surface onto another, I map these things into the plane, and then essentially my degrees of freedom are just the positions of 3 points on that surface. And so in Mobius voting, what they do is they just keep randomly placing those 3 points and making new conformal mappings, and then measuring the distortion of the composed map. And then the voting procedure is saying that like 2 points are likely to get mapped to each other from cat to cat if they tend to lead to low distortion mappings when they align. Does that make sense? And that's what's going on in this technique. So it's extremely simple. It just relies on conformal mapping into the plane and then just some way of randomly drawing a bunch of maps, the plane to itself. So first, the maps from the plane to itself. Those are well known. They're called Mobius transformations. And they all take the form that I've shown you here. Sadly, oh, is this video working? I think it is. I think it comes with, Schumann, right? Anyway.
They're built from 4 basic types. The simple translate. Dilation.
It's leading, it's like, look, it's 3D.
Rotations. And inversions, which turn the plane inside out.
I like that they saved the like mind-bending one for the left.
Either remain lines or transform to circle.
Yeah. Note the key part of this visualization is the right angles that happen between the black lines, right? Notice that all the angles are preserved, even though areas are changing a lot. Okay, it's okay if I quiet our narrator down. Okay. The basic idea is that all of these mappings you can prove are written in this form in the complex numbers. So really, there's only 4 complex numbers you need to parameterize this set of maps. Why did I say 3? Notice I said 3 points, but there's A, B, C, and D here. What's the cool thing about ratios? Yeah, so like really you can like just set D to be 1 or something, right? You can divide by, like there's an extra degree of freedom here. Yeah? Okay. Right, so in reality, what does this algorithm do? Just randomly keeps drawing A, B, and C pairs and looking at the distortion of the map. That's it. Okay? So what is the, so in other words, sort of what they've done is they've taken all the hard mesh stuff and only had to do it once, and then there's this nice easy transition from the plane to itself. Cool? Cool. And this actually enumerates all possible conformal maps from the cat into the other cat, if you think about it, right? Because you only need one map into the plane to do that. Yeah? Okay. There's one detail in this paper which is really cool and fun to read. We don't have enough complex analysis in this course to fill in the details. But one thing that you can show is that harmonic mappings under the right assumptions, where harmonic mappings you get by solving Laplacian equals 0, are conformal. They are angle preserving. You need the right boundary conditions for that to be true. And so what the additional kind of fun side note that happens in this paper is a very careful discretization of the Laplace operator to get this nice conformal mapping into the plane. The basic issue here, what would be the obvious way of mapping a triangle conformally? What is a conformal map of a triangle in like the most high school geometry sense? Remember, it preserves angles but not areas. Scaling, right? That's like the only conformal map of a triangle. Does that make sense? So we might say, well, what should be a conformal map of a triangle mesh? It would be, well, where all the triangles individually scale, right? Maybe by different amounts, but they all scale. Is that a good definition? Just by virtue of my asking, the answer is probably no, yeah? So let's have a very simple counterexample. So for one thing, remember your high school axiomatic style geometry thing, right? And there are all these different theorems about like isometries of triangles, like side, angle, side, and then whatever they were. There was a long list, right? Angle, angle, angle was not among them. But let's say I have two triangles, and they share an edge, and I scale this one, and I say that all of the angles are conserved when I scale. What has to happen to the other guy? He has to scale by the same amount, right? Because they share an edge, and that gave you the scaling factor. Then the rest of the triangle is determined by the three angles. Yeah? So that's bad news for discrete conformality, right? It means that that definition is too rigid. Yeah? And so there's actually, by the way, this is the tip of like a huge iceberg, which are different ways to model conformality of triangle meshes. If you take the course at Carnegie Mellon, I believe you'd spend like 2 months studying that, which reveals the bias of the different instructors. But in any event, in this particular paper, they talk about a mid-edge uniformization technique. The idea is that sort of from a degree of freedom counting standpoint, what goes wrong in this model, like what are your unknowns? They're like the vertex positions, but I have like constraints on the triangles. There's like way more triangles than there are vertices, and so on. So that's where you can get in some trouble. Yeah. So instead, one way to artificially introduce degrees of freedom is to instead ask where do the midpoints of the edges go, because there are more edges than there are anything else. And so they work out a notion of conformality that has to do with the scaling of these like weird inscribed triangles instead of the full mesh. And they show that that thing doesn't lock. It has enough flexibility to give you a conformal map. And then they just have to solve Laplace equals 0, which is our favorite equation in this course. Yeah? So I'll let you read the paper for details. Largely, I think this has been replaced by more modern methods for conformal maps of surfaces, which is itself a big topic in geometry processing. And then the voting algorithm is really simple. So essentially, you just keep randomly drawing triplets of points on the first guy, triplets of points on the second, find the Mobius transformation that just aligns those guys, and then look at the distortion and vote for pairs of points. That's it. Does this give you a bijective map? Really clearly no, right? Because it's just mapping for pairs of points without any knowledge of whether your map is even smooth, right? Yeah, so our trade-offs is that this is relatively efficient. We're down to n cubed time, you know, but the voting procedure, and the voting procedure does handle some non-isometry, right? Like at least we're in the space of conformal mappings now. But on the other hand, the mappings you can get in a technique like this can easily have discontinuities, right? Because there's nothing in this voting procedure saying that like adjacent points have to go to adjacent places. And it doesn't optimize any notion of distortion. And by the way, if you punch a hole in any of your surfaces, you're host, because you don't have a conformal map anymore. Okay? There are many techniques that try to address these issues. One of the most popular ones is something called blended intrinsic maps. All mapping papers compare against this technique, ironically, instead of against each other, because they know they can beat this one. But only by a little, which is why it's a little frustrating. So in blended intrinsic maps, the idea is that like one conformal map isn't going to cut it. Like there's no reason why the surfaces around us are all conformal to each other. Right? That would be super weird. It'd be like you bend your knee and suddenly it get gross to kind of account for that, right? And so instead, what this thing does is says, well, mappings are probably locally conformal. In some sense, we talk about mappings being locally isometric, right? So saying locally conformal is weaker than that, right? And so what this thing does is it says, okay, I'm going to generate a ton of different conformal maps, and then I'm going to try and segment my surface into pieces where each of the individual conformal maps kind of behaves okay. Right? Like, so maybe mapping 1 does okay on left knees, and mapping 2 does okay on right knees, and I'm going to try and stitch them all together. Yeah? And this is this idea of blended, that's the blended part, and then the intrinsic maps comes from the fact that you're doing conformal stuff. Yeah? And this really makes a lot of sense. So what they do is they generate a collection of mappings plus a weight that varies along the surface, saying like, how much does this point trust map number 1? And then the final destination is going to be like the weighted average coming from these different mappings. That makes sense? So the actual steps of this algorithm are pretty straightforward. one of the first thing they do is just randomly sample conformal maps, just like we talked about for the voting technique. But there's a big issue, which is that conformal maps can invert stuff, right? They can be like ones that do left-right flips. And then doing blended matching would be a bad idea, right? Because suddenly you'd flip between hands and you wouldn't see that in the distortion value. So to take care of that, they assume that there's like a very simple symmetry group acting, like just a few kind of clusters of maps that agree. And so what do? Well, everything in this class comes back. They run one of the clustering algorithms we already talked about. So for every pair of maps, that you just cook up some value that says like how close are these maps to one another. That's a simple thing to do, right? Because for every source point, those two maps give two potential target points. And you can just measure the distance. And then you make this big object, which is one of my favorite terms in mathematics, called a confusion matrix. It's like the story of my life, which tells you for every pair of maps how much those maps agree. And you can use that to compute a clustering of your set of maps. Right? So like these are all the ones that take my left hand to Colton's left hand, and these are all the ones that flip us inside out, and so on. Yep. And then they just run this blended intrinsic maps thing on one of those clusters. And that's their way of fixing that problem. These are extremely heuristic methods, by the way. These are not optimization algorithms by any means. Yeah? Okay, so that's the way they get consistent maps. Then the next thing you have to do is find blending weights. That's relatively straightforward. We have all these distortion measures, right? So a relatively good blending weight is just the distortion measure. But remember that, is this distortion measure going to tell me anything in this algorithm? No, right? Because I'm blending conformal maps. This thing is always 0. Yeah? So the relevant one is closer to this, right? Like how the triangles scale from one to another. Yeah? So in other words, the weight grows if the singular values are close to 1. You guys can cook up all reasonable ways to do that. It doesn't really matter what the details are. And then finally, you just blend, and that's extremely easy. So what they do is they literally, for every source point, well, now you have a bunch of different target points with weights. You average them together and just project onto the surface again. Yeah? And this actually is a pretty effective technique. So here are some examples. By the way, this code you can download online for this, and it's pretty reliable. You can see that these are fairly non-isometric objects, at least on the upper left there, and it still does a reasonable job. One thing that you have to be a little careful about, this color scheme is extremely deceptive, and sometimes it's hard to see whether the maps are differentiable, right? Because the color scheme itself is so smooth. But at least in this figure, it's doing okay. So here's I don't know what the guy is on the left, but the relevant thing is on the right-hand side. So these are plots that we talked about at the beginning of, yikes, I never looked closely at that. In any event, okay, the relevant thing here is the color, right? So you have blue going to red, and roughly you can see the portions of the surface that are getting mapped well and poorly, right? So unsurprisingly, these kinds of algorithms tend to do well near interesting features because those are the easiest ones to compare. Farther away from those, the map degrades. I'm sorry, I've taught this many times, I never really looked at it. Yeah, so the pros here are that we're starting to handle non-isometry. This is a relatively efficient technique, but you need lots of area distortion because clearly we're preferring conformal maps in this procedure. And again, if you want to map donuts, you're out of luck. Yep. By the way, conformal maps between donuts, I believe, is an open problem in discrete differential geometry, but one that's maybe a little niche. Actually, I guess that's not true anymore because of this orbifold method. I have to come back to that because they're weird singular points, and I don't know how you cope with that. Okay, as one final thing for you guys to think about today, and then we'll finish. And actually, at the beginning of next lecture, I thought for fun, I'd tell you about a paper that we published that's coming out in a couple of months that I think is state-of-the-art in this area. But for now, just to tell you a little bit about some considerations. One thing that we haven't talked about a lot, but is actually absolutely critical in this literature, is an issue of representation. So in math, when we talk about maps, maybe you're a category theorist, you're used to thinking about this stuff. What is a map? It's a thing that takes a point on one thing to a point on another. Pretty unambiguous. What is a map when you have triangle meshes? Well, we've actually secretly seen a lot of different notions of that just in the lecture today. I haven't really highlighted it, right? We talked about permutations. Like the conformal maps would be some shared thing, but there's no reason why the triangles have to line up, right? And there's a big issue here, which is it's actually not clear how to define what a map is, right? Because, for instance, even just two different meshes of the same teddy bear you're very unlikely to find a permutation of the vertices of one on the vertices of another, which is perfect, right? Just by virtue of them not having the same number of vertices, there's nothing else, right? And furthermore, like you could say, like, okay, so I fixed that by just letting vertices go to the interior of triangles. Fine, I buy that. But then what happens in between those? How do you interpolate? Yeah? Like, for instance, if whoa. Let's say this is triangle mesh 1, and triangle mesh 2 gets mapped onto it like that. It's really unclear how to interpolate the interior vertices of this object. Yeah? This is a big problem in this literature, and one that really got glossed over until 5-10 years ago. And there are many ways to think about it. Like maybe it's a permutation, maybe it's some approximation of some smooth object, maybe there's some probabilistic thing going on, like there's some function on the other guy that tells you the probability of every source point getting mapped to every target. There are a lot of different ways to write this problem down. Yeah? So one of the really popular ideas in this area, which I think is a really cool point of comparison, and one that's come up a little bit in this course, is this idea of functional maps. So this dates back to 2012, and then became its own little cottage industry of paper writing at Symposium on Geometry Processing, including many of my own. So the idea here is, let's say that I have a map from M naught to M, okay? Right, so for every point here, I have a point over there. Okay, so now I take my can of spray paint, and I take M, and I paint it with these psychedelic colors, okay? I claim I have a means of now painting the left guy the same way, right? Because for every point here, what do? I follow my map forward, and I say, oh, that point is purple, so I'm going to color that point purple. Okay? So for every map from M0 to M, I have a way of transferring color from M to M0. Has any of you guys taken a category theory class? No? So this is this idea of covariant and contravariant functors going on here. It's precisely what's hiding inside of this math. People in this area like to talk about it and then not actually use that area of math for any insight, because as far as I can tell, there's no insight to be had in category theory. Okay, so in any event, sorry, so for every sort of geometric object, there's a corresponding object which takes, okay, maybe not color, but functions, right? Like an assignment of one number per vertex or per point on the right-hand side, and pulls it back to the left-hand side. Cool? This object we're going to call a functional map. Okay? And this is this neat trick, which is extremely popular. Right, and it really, it was inspired by stuff in category theory, but nobody knows what category theory is. So what are some properties of that map? So let's say that I have a map from one person into another, and I have two functions on the second guy, and I add them together, yeah? And now I pull them back, right? I apply the functional map with a pullback. What's going to happen on the source guy? So I could have pulled back those two functions individually. If I add them together over here, I have two options. I could add them together over here, or I could add them together over here and then pull them back. And I claim that those are the same, for kind of obvious reasons, right? Because it's just a mapping. What does that indicate about this operator? This operator f sub phi. It is linear in the space of functions, not in the space of points on the surface, right? So in other words, I can either, again, I can add together two things and then map them, or I can map them and then map them together, and that's the same thing. And similarly, I could scale a function over here and then map it, or I could map it and then scale it. That's the same thing. What do linear things look like? Matrices, and we like matrices. We're good at matrices, yeah? And so in particular, what can we do? Well, once again, our favorite Laplacian operator is going to come up, because the eigenfunctions of Laplacian give a basis for this set of functions. Right? I can take any function on my surface and write it as a linear combination of Laplacian eigenfunctions. So, what is a functional map? It's actually just a matrix acting on that basis. Kind of neat, huh? So, this is a way to take this mapping problem, which is sort of geometric looking, and translate it to a linear algebra problem. Yeah? And so why is that useful? Well, a priori it's not. Right? This is like kind of fun fact. Category theory, that's cool. But it actually leads to a lot of practical algorithms for correspondence. Until about 2 years ago, I would not have used the word practical, but actually people have managed. This is a great success story in the sense that when we wrote the original functional maps paper, I can say we, by the way, it really wasn't useful. It only computed maps between isometric objects, but people were really excited and interested in it. And actually, they've made it work. And now the state-of-the-art correspondence routines really do use this picture. Yeah. So the idea is to compute this matrix directly. And there's kind of an interesting observation, which is, obviously, if I have a mapping of points to points, I could compute the functional map matrix pretty easily, just by linear algebra. And what do you notice about these two matrices? So this is the one that just takes cats to cats. This is the one that takes the head to the tail. So this is the cat inversion map. And somehow this one's more sparse looking. What would it look like if this map were actually isometry? Let's say the cat doesn't have repeated eigenvalues, which is not true because he has a symmetry. But it would be diagonal, right? Because what do you know? Well, if the two shapes are isometric to one another, then all of their Laplacian eigenfunctions have to be the same, right? So it's actually quite easy to derive the functional map in that case. Yeah? And more generally, think back to when we talked about Gaussian curvature, right? So remember that discretely Gaussian curvature is really just one number per vertex, yeah? What do I know about an isometric map? What happens to Gaussian curvature under an isometry? Nothing, that's what. Yeah, it's intrinsic, right? So what do I know? If I have Gaussian curvature on one surface, I have Gaussian curvature on the other surface. If I apply my functional map, I know that this guy has got to get mapped to that guy. Does that make sense? Because if I know that my map is on isometry, I know that it has to push forward Gaussian curvature to Gaussian curvature. Yeah? And similarly, let's say that I have the heat kernel at time t, and the heat kernel signature at time t, rather, and some other heat kernel signature on the other guy at time t. My map is on isometry. What do I know? I know that when I apply my map to that thing, I have to get the other guy. Does that make sense? And I can do that for a lot of different functions. So what is my here's the thing. These objects, these are computable from the shapes themselves. They don't involve mapping, right? So in effect, I have some unknown matrix. There's my functional map. And here's a bunch of descriptors that I can just put in the columns. You know, here's descriptor 1, here's descriptor 2, and here's descriptor 1 on the other surface. Here's descriptor 2 on the other surface, and so on. A bunch of linear conditions. What happens if I have more of these than I have vertices on my mesh? How can I get A? I can just post-multiply by the inverse of this matrix, right? So in other words, if I have enough descriptors that match from one surface onto another, recovering the functional map is just a linear algebra problem. It's just something AX equals B, right? And that was the sort of nice insight here. Yeah? Does that make sense to everybody? That if I have a bunch of pairs of descriptors that match, and I have this linear condition that my functional map has to take one to the other, if I have enough of them, I can just get a mapping from linear algebra. That's all that's saying. How well do you think this works? What was that? Oh, sure. If I have bad descriptors, that like if my descriptors are repetitive, then this is not a good procedure. But yeah. So the reality is, how do you get this many descriptors? Well, actually, remember that heat kernel theorem that told me that if I know the heat kernel on T, I can distinguish a point. That actually secretly tells you that this matrix is invertible. What's the larger issue? Heat kernel's dense. Yes. For one thing, these matrices are dense. You know you'll get something like kind of diagonal looking when you invert, but that's not true when you write it down. So you violated rule number 1 of this course. Maybe that's actually okay here because you truncate, you do it like on a smaller basis or something. But the larger issue is that these descriptors aren't terribly reliable. And I put an equal sign here. I've put a really hard constraint. And that's where this technique originally kind of fell apart a little bit. But there are a lot of ways of kind of patching it up. So one of the neat ones, let's say that I have a function on one of my surfaces, and I apply the Laplacian to it, so I get another function. Okay? So, and then I map that thing to the other surface, right? So I have some function, I apply a Laplacian to it, and then I apply my functional map. Okay? Or I could do the opposite of that, right? I could take my function, I could apply the functional map, and then I could use the other surface's Laplacian on that thing. If my map is an isometry, what is this difference? 0, right? Because remember that isometric things preserve Laplace operator, yeah? So yet another term I can throw in the pot here is functional map Laplacian minus Laplacian. These are actually two different Laplacians, right? One's on one surface, one's on the other. And functional map. I can throw that term in there. And this is a way to regularize my optimization problem, that it should commute with the Laplacian operator. The nice thing is this is a full rank matrix. I don't need all these descriptors anymore to recover my map. Yeah, and so the name of the game in the functional maps literature is cooking up like, oh, well, if my map is smooth, then maybe it commutes with this particular operator I cooked up. So I throw that into my optimization problem for this matrix. And so it's extremely simple algorithm, which is just solving for some least squares matrix that like preserves descriptors and commutes with a bunch of operators. You can actually prove cool theorems, which is like, for instance, that the functional map matrix is orthogonal if and only if your map itself is isometric. So maybe you kind of regularize your map to almost look like the identity if you multiply by the transpose and so on. And this was a really nice idea for many reasons. One is that these optimization problems are real valued. You don't have like permutations anymore. And the other is that you can truncate. You could shrink the size of your basis and still get kind of a reasonable low frequency approximation of a mapping. There are many, many, many papers with variations of this technique, but it's still hard to handle some non-isometry, right? Like baked into this constraint, for example, is that f is isometric, right? So there's some wiggle room now because I'm making it least squares, but not a ton. And so a lot of work has gone into relaxing this. Yeah? So in 10 seconds or less, here's some pictures of different clever tricks people do to patch up functional maps. One is to replace that Laplacian basis with some other one. One of the big issues with Laplacian basis is it has support over the whole surface, which is sort of difficult when what you care about are local features. So maybe you replace that. For example, in the coupled quasi-harmonic basis, you want to find, you actually compute the bases on both surfaces at the same time with some term that tries to make the two look like each other, which is kind of neat. Maybe you try to quotient by a symmetry group. So here the octopus comes up a lot. He has an 8-way symmetry, and maybe you want to actually only map an octopus sector in your mapping algorithm to kind of take care of some of the ambiguity there. One of the interesting questions you might ask is, notice that nothing about this talks about those distortion measures, like changes in singular value, but they're actually hiding in this matrix F. And so there's a really cool piece of research by Raif Rustamov called Shape Differences, where they show how by doing linear algebra on that matrix, you can actually like get functions that highlight where your map distorts. That's actually hiding in these singular values of F if you do it in just the right way. So there's a lot of different techniques out there for functional maps. And this is an ongoing thing. I think every year there's like 5 to 10 more papers that propose different extensions of this method. And I think it's a good point of comparison just because it's a totally different representation of a map. That sort of the replacement is, okay, I don't have permutations anymore. I have linear algebra, but it's a little bit stiff. Yep. If you want a really hard problem to keep you up late at night, let's say I have one of these maps in the Laplace-Beltrami basis. So I have this big matrix which tells me how to take Fourier functions to Fourier functions. Can you look at those coefficients and know when does that actually correspond to something that takes points to points as opposed to just a random function? That's a really hard thing to derive. Okay, with that, we're over time, so we'll stop there. I love mapping stuff. I can talk about it all day. But we'll continue next time, talk about what